They say the silence of a house tells you more about your life than the noise ever could. For 12 years, the silence in my home felt like peace. I'm Cooper Reed, and I've spent the better part of my 38 years working the high-voltage lines across the Midwest. I've lived my life by a simple code: show up early, stay late, and protect the people you love. I thought that code was enough to build a fortress, but I was wrong. I wasn't protecting a fortress. I was guarding a cage. How many of you watching this right now have ever felt like you were living two different lives? If you've ever felt that gut instinct, drop a comment below. And if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. I'm sharing this because I need you to know that the betrayal you feel is real. The night it all came crashing down was just like any other Tuesday in October. I was sitting in my truck in a motel parking lot 3 hours away from home, pulling a double shift to make sure we could afford that trip to Cancun Madeline had been talking about. Madeline, my Maddie. She told me she was going on a girls' weekend to a spa in the Hocking Hills. I even packed her bag for her. I was too busy looking at the sun to notice the shadows growing behind me. And then there was Harrison, my older brother. The guy who always had the right suit, the right car, and the right thing to say. When he moved back to town and started coming over for dinner 3 nights a week, I welcomed him with open arms. I was sitting in the cab of my truck when my phone started vibrating. It was a FaceTime request from Maddie. I swiped the screen, a smile already forming on my face. "Hey babe," I started to say, but the words died in my throat. The camera wasn't pointed at her face. It was resting on a flat surface angled toward a ceiling fan. It wasn't a spa in Hocking Hills. It was a high-end hotel in downtown Chicago. For a second, I thought it was a mistake, a pocket dial. But then the audio kicked in. It was the sound of a laugh, a deep, confident rumble that I'd heard at every Thanksgiving dinner since I was 5 years old. It was Harrison. I heard Maddie's voice. She was talking about how she didn't want the weekend to end, about how hard it was to go back to the routine at home. "He's a good man, Harrison," she whispered, and I felt my soul shrivel up. "But he's so simple." "He sees what I want him to see," Harrison replied. "Cooper has always been the foundation, Maddie. And foundations are meant to be walked on." The betrayal didn't hit me all at once. It was like a slow-motion car crash. I thought about Mama Pearl. She died believing her boys were a team. I looked back at the screen. For a split second, I saw a flash of skin, a shoulder, a hand. And there on the nightstand was the watch I'd given Harrison for his 30th birthday. An heirloom piece I'd spent 6 months of savings on. It was sitting there ticking away the seconds of my life while they laughed at the simple man. I realized then that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a long-term plan. Every time Harrison checked in on us, every time Maddie stayed late, it was all part of the game. I had been fueling the fire that was burning my own house down. I felt a coldness start to creep into my limbs. I watched for another 3 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather began to tear. I saw the shadows move against the wall. They were toasting to a life they'd stolen from me. I thought about Sawyer. He'd tried to tell me a few months ago, but I'd laughed it off. I'd defended them. The shame of that memory felt like a hot iron against my skin. I took a deep breath, the cold air finally reaching my lungs. I reached out a finger, tapping the icon to turn on my own camera and the microphone. I brought the phone close to my face. I looked 10 years older than I had this morning. My eyes were hollow, my face set in a mask of granite. "You're right about one thing, Harrison," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was low steady. Foundations are meant to be walked on, but when a foundation cracks, the whole damn house comes down. The silence on the other end was instantaneous. I watched the screen as the phone was fumbled, the image spinning wildly before settling on a face. It was Harrison. His eyes were wide, the arrogance stripped away. Behind him, I saw Maddie scramble to cover herself, her face a mask of pure terror. I didn't give them a chance to speak. There was nothing left to explain. I looked directly into the camera, staring straight into my brother's eyes. I wanted him to see the man he had broken. I reached out and slowly pressed the red button, the screen going black, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the rain turn into a downpour that felt like it would never end. The darkness inside my truck felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest until every breath became a chore. I stared at the black mirror of my phone screen. The ghost of Harrison's terrified expression still burned into my retinas like a flashbulb afterimage. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had slowed to a heavy, rhythmic thud. I reached out and touched the ignition, the vibration of the engine sending a shudder through the steering wheel. For 12 years, this truck had been my sanctuary. Now it was just a metal box idling in a world that had turned upside down. If you're still with me, think about the one person you trust with your life. Imagine finding out they've been using those keys to unlock the back door while you're out working yourself to the bone. It's a bitterness that no amount of coffee or whiskey can wash away. If you've ever had to drive through the night with nowhere to go but away from the lies, leave a comment. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your presence here is the only thing keeping me grounded tonight. I pulled out of that motel parking lot, the gravel crunching under my tires like the sound of bones breaking. I didn't head toward Chicago to find that hotel. Instead, I drove south back toward the state line, toward the town where I'd spent every dime I'd ever earned to build a life for a woman who didn't want it. My mind kept jumping back to the past. I thought about the winter of 18. I was out for 72 hours straight, climbing poles encased in frozen glass. I remembered calling Maddie. I told her the only thing keeping me warm was the thought of coming home to her. I remembered Harrison coming over that following weekend to celebrate my safe return. He'd patted my shoulder and said, "Cooper, you're the backbone of this family." I thought I was finally standing on equal footing with my big brother. But now that bourbon tasted like lie. I realized he wasn't celebrating my safety. He was celebrating my utility. I was the one who worked the dangerous job so he could have the luxury of time he spent in my house with my wife. The rain turned into a thick, misty fog as I crossed into Ohio. I'd ignored the small things because I didn't want to be the jealous husband Harrison always joked about. I reached the outskirts of our town around 3 a.m. I didn't go straight home. I found myself driving past the old house where Mama Pearl had raised us. I could almost see us as kids, me always following Harrison around. He'd taught me how to look out for yourself first. I guess I only learned the first 2 lessons. "You're too soft, Coop," Harrison used to tell me. "The world doesn't give a damn about your rules." I felt a sudden vibration in my pocket. It was a text from Maddie. "Please, Cooper, just listen. It's not what you think. We need to talk. I'm coming home right now." The ultimate gaslight. I'd watched them on a live feed, heard them laugh at my simplicity, and she still thought she could talk her way out of it. She didn't think I was a man. She thought I was a puppet whose strings she could still pull. I didn't reply. I drove to the park at the edge of town where we'd had our wedding photos taken. I pulled the wedding band off my finger. Forever is a long time for a lie. I whispered. I just dropped it into the tall grass at my feet. I didn't need a ceremony to end what they had already buried. I headed back to the truck and drove to our house. The lights were off. I walked up the front steps, but I didn't use my key. That house wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of a life that had been a fraud. I walked to the garage and pulled out a storage bin. I pulled out my work gear, my tools, and a single box of my mother's things. That was all I needed. They could have the rest. I wasn't going to fight over a grave. I heard the sound of a car engine in the distance. I didn't look back. I didn't care if it was Harrison or Maddie. I put the Ford in gear and drove away from the lies. I steered the truck toward the outskirts of town, my eyes fixed on the empty road ahead as the morning light began to wash away the shadows of the night. The hum of the highway had become a low, vibrating growl beneath my floorboards, a sound that felt like it was trying to drown out the echoes of my own thoughts. I kept my eyes fixed on the white lines of the road, watching them disappear under my hood like the minutes of my marriage. Every mile I put between myself and that driveway felt like a layer of skin being peeled back, painful, raw, but necessary. I wasn't running away. I was clearing the blast zone. I knew that within an hour, that house would be filled with the frantic, desperate energy of two people trying to save their reputations, and I refused to be the audience for their performance. For those of you still listening, tell me something. Have you ever realized that the happily ever after you were working for was actually a carefully crafted lie? If you've ever had to walk out of your own life with nothing but the truth in your pocket, let me know in the comments. How did you handle that first hour of freedom? And if you haven't yet, subscribe. We're building a community for the people who had to learn the hard way that family isn't always a sanctuary. I pulled into Sawyer's driveway just as the sun began to bleed a bruised purple and orange across the horizon. Sawyer was already out on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't ask what happened. He just handed me a cold thermos of coffee. "Everything's blown, Sawyer," I said, leaning against the side of my truck. I saw them. Live. It was Harrison. It was always him. Sawyer didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded. "A man like Harrison doesn't know how to build anything, Coop. He only knows how to move into what's already standing. I tried to tell you, but I knew you had to see the smoke before you'd believe the fire was real." We sat there in silence for a while. I realized that for the last decade, I had defined myself as the reliable one for Madeline and Harrison. Without those titles, I felt like a ghost. But as the caffeine started to hit my system, that ghost started to grow some teeth. I pulled my phone out, a graveyard of notifications. 52 missed calls. Harrison was already worried about the family name. I felt a surge of cold, sharp energy. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. I opened our joint bank account app. Every cent I'd sweated for was there. They expected me to be the simple man they'd mocked. I transferred exactly half of the balance into a private account. Then I did something the old Cooper would never have done. I took the other half, her half, and I sent it to a local charity Mama Pearl used to support. If she wanted to fund a new life with my brother, she wasn't going to do it on the back of my labor. "What's the plan, Coop?" Sawyer asked. "I'm not going back to the house," I said, my voice sounding harder. "I'm going to see Harrison's partners at the firm. I think they'd be real interested to know that their director of ethics spent his business trip in a hotel room with his brother's wife." Sawyer chuckled a dark sound. "You're finally learning, son. When the house is on fire, you don't try to save the drapes. You just make sure the people who started it can't hide in the shadows." I realized that the American dream was just a cage with gold bars. By walking away, I'd stolen the keys back. I spent the next few hours in Sawyer's garage sorting through my tools. These were things they couldn't take: my skills, my work ethic, my ability to survive. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was the landline from the house. They were home. I could picture them standing in the kitchen, seeing the empty closet and the quiet, echoing absence of the man they had taken for granted. I let it ring. "They're going to try to flip this on you," Sawyer warned. "Let them," I said. "A man who's lost everything is the most stable man in the world because he's got nothing left to lose." I walked out to the truck. The fog was gone. The path was clear. I pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of my pocket, the address of Harrison's firm. I didn't feel like a simple man anymore. I felt like a man who was about to show the world exactly what happens when you break the foundation of a good life. I put the truck in gear, the engine's roar sounding like a battle cry, and I began to head back toward the city, my eyes locked on the horizon where the tall buildings of Harrison's world were just beginning to appear. The skyline of the city rose up like a jagged wall of glass and steel shimmering under the midday sun. It was a world Harrison had always belonged to, a world of high-stakes negotiations where the truth was just another commodity. As I pulled my dusty Ford into the sleek underground parking garage of his firm, I felt like a splinter in a polished surface. I didn't belong here, but that was exactly why I was the most dangerous man in the building. I wasn't there to negotiate. I was there to settle a debt that couldn't be paid in cash. To everyone who has followed this journey to the end, have you ever realized that the end of your world was actually just the beginning of your freedom? If you've survived a betrayal that should have broken you, drop a comment with the word warrior. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. This is my last chapter of the old life, and I'm glad you're here to see the new one begin. I stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of my work boots. The receptionist looked at me like I was a delivery driver who had lost his way. I didn't give her a chance to ask for my ID. I walked straight toward the glass-walled conference room, where I knew the senior partners held their weekly lunch meeting. My heart was a steady, heavy drum in my chest, not from fear, but from a cold, unwavering resolve. I wasn't the simple man anymore. I was a man with nothing left to lose. I pushed open the heavy doors. Harrison was there, sitting at the head of the table, looking every bit the golden boy. Beside him sat the men who held his future in their hands. When he saw me, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. The cocky smirk he'd worn in that hotel room was nowhere to be found. "Cooper, what are you doing here?" He stammered, his voice cracking in front of his peers. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I simply walked over and placed the thumb drive I'd prepared on the mahogany table. On it was the recorded video call, the one where he mocked his own blood while destroying a 12-year marriage. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in our lives, he was the one who looked away first. "I'm just delivering some transparency, Harrison," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden sharp silence of the room. "Since you're the director of ethics, I thought your partners should see how you handle your personal contracts." I turned and walked out before the first image even flickered onto the screen. I didn't need to stay for the fallout. I knew that by the time I reached the lobby, his perfect career would be as hollow as his promises. I felt a strange light sensation in my chest, the weight of the Reed family legacy finally falling away, leaving me unburdened for the first time in 45 years. The drive back to the outskirts was different. I didn't head toward the house. I headed toward the small wooded lot I'd bought years ago, a place Mama Pearl used to call the Peaceful Acre. It was just dirt and trees, but it was mine, truly mine. I pulled out my phone one last time. A final message from Maddie. Where are you? We can fix this. I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. And nothing was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. I deleted the message, blocked the number, and watched the screen go dark. I looked at my hands, dirty, scarred, and strong. I realized that Harrison and Maddie hadn't stolen my life. They had just occupied it for a while. The man who built the foundation was still here. As the first fireflies of the evening began to blink, I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, a real one. The American dream I'd chased was dead, and in its place was something much better. The truth. I was exactly where I was supposed to be.